that Susan and her staff have been rather busy at Planning Commission. So thank you for getting this into your schedule and ours, and take it away.
Thank you very much, Mayor. And I do apologize that you are going to see us so much. Hopefully, it won't be too overwhelming. We have several work sessions on this when we understand that we've just scheduled another work session on fossil fuels, which is going to be as part of Tuesdays too, briefly, hopefully. So earlier this week on Tuesday, we covered a couple of projects related to the zoning code. Deborah discussed the residential and open space zoning map and the community involvement program. Today we're going to talk about 4 other pieces. We're going to start with the mixed use project, an overview of the map and code changes related to employment land supply. We'll talk about new campus designations and a wrap up of some of the miscellaneous code changes. And then, as the mayor just mentioned, next Tuesday we will cover sort of phase 2 of the Transportation Systems Plan, and PBOT will lead that discussion. We'll be here, but they will lead that. We know it's lots of information. That's why we're doing this work session, really, so that you have an opportunity to know some of the questions that you're going to be asked and some of the information that you're going to be hearing actually at the hearings, because this has been a very in-depth issue, and hundreds of people have commented and come to hearings at the Planning and Sustainability Commission. A reminder that although these binders are thick and there's lots of information in there, in general, all the things that you already asked us to do as part of the comp plan, that's what these things are. This is basically putting those decisions and intent into code. And so we're not opening up huge new issues that you haven't already visited. So if there's not any questions, I'll turn it over to Eric, and then also here are Eric and Tom actually will do presentations. Barry Manning headed up the mixed use project. Cole is here, who headed up the campus and institutions project, and Steve headed up the work on employment lands. And I just publicly wanted to thank the 3 of them and their senior planners. Between them and on their own, they each have decades of experience in working with the city and have led these projects really successfully. So,
Susan, I do have a comment, which is that I was rather disappointed with the title of the first staff report, because I just assumed it would be called From the Mixed Use Files of Ms. Susan B. Anderson. So to not see that language in the cover was quite disappointing.
we'll work on that. All right.
Thank you. So I'm going to cover the mixed use zones, and as Susan mentioned, Barry Manning is here, who's been the project lead, if there are questions that I can't answer. I want to try to go over the project objectives, give you an overview of the new zoning, both the map and the code, talk a little bit about the development and design standards that come with it, and then flag the potential issues that you're likely to hear about in testimony. So why did we take on overhauling our commercial mixed use zones? Aside from the fact that they always have been mixed use zones and they were poorly named as commercial zones, it goes more than just a retitling. One is tied to the comp plan that about half of the expected growth over the next 20 years we expect to accommodate in mixed use corridors and centers outside the central city. And so that's the single biggest recipient of growth. And so we paid a lot of attention to what those codes look like. It's also been more than 20 years since we took a complete overhaul and look at those zones. And during that period, we've actually had mixed-use development. Last time we revisited these codes, there hadn't really been any on the ground. It was all kind of a hypothetical vision from a planning point of view. And so now we have a lot more experience with actual development that we can learn from and tailor the regulations a little better. So the objectives were also to address building scale, transitions to residential areas, context, some of the historic context, some of the scale contexts. We want to make sure that what comes out of this process is still market feasible, so we've done a lot of economic modeling as we went along in this process. Affordable housing has been a huge issue throughout the planning of this process, and it's been one of the #1 things we've heard as we've as we've talked to the public about this. So we want to talk about how this code can help with that issue. We want to continue to allow a variety of commercial and employment and housing types in the mixed-use zones. And we want to look at equity as it relates to this particular form of development. Equity in the fairness and public involvement sense rather than the real estate sense in this case. So the major elements, moving on to page 5 of your handout, the major elements of the project include a rewritten chapter 130, which is the commercial mixed-use zones chapter, 5 new zones, which together have a new structure of massing and size allowances with bonuses, revised development standards, and a new zoning map. We also have proposed a new overlay zone, the Center's Main Street overlay, which is, I'll talk a bit more about in a minute. We've proposed expanding the design overlay zone in some strategic locations, and we've added some important transportation planning requirements into the mix with this kind of development. So to turn to the pictures, because it's easier to describe what's happening if we look at some diagrams. On page 6, there's kind of a box-like picture, and that's essentially what our current code allows is you're allowed to fill up the box up to the height limit and the setbacks, and there are very few standards related to the form of the building or the design, except for when you're in a design review, and then there's a big discretionary process. In a nutshell, the new code has floor area ratios that apply to all the types of development in there, so you no longer entirely get a by right allowance to fill up the box. And there are some additional development standards that mean that you can't just do a square box to the edges of the setback. And I'll go into those details as we go through here. The other thing that before we go too much further, I think it's useful to talk about the floor area ratio. I think you probably all know what that means, but just to make sure, the FAR is the measure of massing, and it basically is a ratio of the site area to the floor area of the building. So 1-to-1 FAR means you can fill up the whole site as 1 story, you could fill up half the site as 2 story, or you could fill up a quarter of the site as 4 stories. It's a floor area of the building over the floor of the square footage of the site. So it's a way of controlling the mass of development.
You can see that on page 9.
Right, on page 9. So that's kind of a fundamental concept in this. Right. So the result of this work is, as I mentioned, 5 new zones, which are shown on page 10. The CR, the CM1, CM2, CM3, and CE. And they are progressively bigger in scale, essentially from left to right, with the CR being the smallest zone intended for very isolated sort of one-off commercial sites that are really in the middle of single-family neighborhoods, all the way up to CM3, which is the most urban of the zones, which would be intended for places that are at light rail stations and very close to the central city. CE zone is a more general commercial zone, which still allows housing, but is oriented a little bit differently in its uses. It also allows a slightly broader array of light employment and industrial uses, and does not have as many bonuses. I'll talk a little bit more about the details of these zones, but before I do, on page 11 is a kind of a key concept in this whole project. The dotted line represents kind of the existing entitlements that people have today. And one of our core concepts was the idea that there's a base allowance of entitlements by right, and then there's a second level that you can achieve if you provide a public benefit of some kind. And there's different theories about how to go about that. Of course, some folks said, well, the best way to do that is to reduce the base allowance and then let people bonus back to what they have today. The development community had a different perspective and said, well, let's keep the current base and give more as bonus. And the circle indicates kind of the preferred recommended path, which does both. And to be blunt, that makes everyone angry. But what it does is recognize that there are concerns about the scale of some of the development today, and there's a feeling in the community that we ought to be getting more community benefit for that scale and that kind of development. There's a trade-off there. People are willing to accept greater bulk if there's a clarity of community benefit coming to them. And then the reality is to make the market work and to make it the resulting development market feasible, we may need to also go a little bit above what our current allowances as part of that bonus to make it financially a worthwhile bonus to pursue. So we did both.
So question about that, are we also making as standards things that used to be bonuses, like community gathering space and extra bike racks and
Yeah,
such?
we've considerably pared down the list of bonuses to essentially two, both related to affordability, which I'll go into in a minute. But many of the things that used to be bonuses are now requirements.
Good.
So to continue on, the next few slides are basically a little bit of an illustrated guide to these different zones. And so starting with the CR zone, there's some pictures of the scale of development we're talking about. This is kind of the corner store zone. If you've got a corner store in the middle of a residential neighborhood, instead of those being non-conforming uses, we've zoned them to be allowed by right, but we gave them a fairly small scale zone to fit into the community. CM1 is the smallest scale of the three, sort of 1, 2, 3 CM zones that are numbered. And that's a 3-story zone essentially with bonusable to a slightly larger floor area, but not height bonuses. The one on the left in the CM1, that is in CR. That's on Clinton Street, I believe. CM1, again, that's more of a 3-story zone, and it has a scaled up floor area ratio, so you can either fill up part of the site or more of the site if you get a bonus.
And does it require that setback of the upper story?
No.
So but in some places we could have a planned district that would?
There are some districts that do that. There's also a facade articulation standard that would be one of the options to meet, and I'll go into that in a minute. CM2 is essentially a 4-story zone with a bonus to a 5th story in some areas, particularly centers, larger centers and areas that have design review as well. I should mention that the step back from the street is something that the Planning Commission changed. The staff recommendation initially was to have a step back above the 4th floor. In this zone, the Planning Commission recommended against that, and so the bonus would be allowed to go up the full.
What was the basis for that?
Concern about the economic viability of the bonus and affordable housing concerns. CM3 is a larger, that would be one of the issues, by the way, that you'll no doubt hear about. The CM3 is a larger scale zone, loosely equivalent to the EX zone today, so that allows a 5 to 7-story building, depending on the bonus use or not. And you can see some recently built examples of the kind of thing you would expect in that zone.
I just want to keep following up on this step back thing. If we're not requiring it, then we should give illustrations that don't.
Yeah, we're working on that. The change was made a few weeks ago from the Planning Commission, so we haven't quite caught up to them.
Well, and we are requiring them back.
Right, the step down to the residential zoning on the back is still part of the proposal. And that was part of the give and take, was there was concern about requiring that on all sides and eroding the floor plate to the point where the cost was affected. Again, I am just finishing up 15.
I just have a question about, all the examples on 14 and 15 look like they're first cousins from the same family. And I worry that we're going to become a city that has a lot of these kind of blocky type developments that look like they're all done in 1 or 2 architect shops, and that, frankly, that we're going to get a kind of a uniform look and not enough variety of look, which is what we love about cities, is the different styles and shapes and colors. And so is that something we tackle through this exercise, or is that something we tackle through design guidelines, or what's the mechanism to get more differentiated sort of exteriors and massing and shaping? So I noticed, for example, the other day, I know North Williams takes its fair share of abuse these days, but I was kind of struck by the similarities between these heavy apartment buildings that seemed to crowd out a lot of light, and it was very heavy and thick, and it may be appropriate in some places, but I hope we're encouraging a diversity of styles and shapes and sizes.
I think the two ways that we're trying to go about that are, one, through this project, we have introduced some massing standards, which should reduce the number of really super long, big buildings, and some of the buildings on Williams would not meet this new standard. For example, some of these might not either, because we didn't test all these against the details of those standards. The other way is we are proposing to expand the territory covered by design review and the design overlay, which gives us a little more of a tool there. And you're exactly right that the design standards that accompany that overlay is one thing that we need to update, and that's part of the follow-up to the DOZA project, to be looking at that.
Some might say it's a small factor, but returning to this question of the front side step back, granted, you can still have very similar looking buildings, but how an architect does this could vary from building to building.
Yeah.
At least gives another opportunity for differentiation. It doesn't guarantee it, but another window that you might see a different scheme come through.
Yeah, and to be,
I've seen an awful lot of good buildings done that way. There's a lot of good solutions for that.
and all these pictures were taken more or less of buildings built more or less in the same 2-year period, so there is definitely a style that was happening in that particular year.
If I can add one other thing, I think it's notable, since all of the large-scale zones at CM3, the design overlay zone comes automatically with that, so we do expect a little bit of oversight from the design side. And the larger scale fifth-story allowance CM2 zones also come with the D overlay, so we are going to have a little bit more oversight on those.
And by the way, I moved recently. I live up on Kings Hill, and what's interesting is there are a lot of buildings up there, apartment buildings, that also reflect a certain moment in history. I almost feel like I'm back at Queens, New York. It's enormous complexes, tall, very broad vista, St. Clair being a good example. And I actually wish we had more variety. I think those buildings serve a function. You get killer views, in some of those buildings, next to some of the more modern stuff, and then some buildings using more glass, not less glass, and those kinds of things to create different styles and juxtapositions.
So what was the nature of the controversy we're going to hear about in the CM2 again? Can you just?
Well, these illustrations show that the design approach where you step back the top floors on the front street-facing side of the buildings, and as well as the backside facing the residential. And that was initially the staff recommendation. We heard a lot of testimony on both sides of that, and the Plan Commission decided to remove the step back on the front street-facing side. And I think that they found the argument about the economics of that compelling, that it's an issue with affordable housing and the cost of the
But is that just where there is a residential zone behind?
yes.
So that,
Oh, the front step back?
The front step back is on the main corridors.
Right.
It doesn't go all the way around.
But it's not affected by the adjacent zone.
No, but the back one
The
is.
back one, yes. So the back one is for if you're adjacent to a single-family residence,
Right.
lower
Correct.
designation.
Or
but then is the converse true? If you're not, are we then requiring the setback up front?
Yeah, well, no, we're not requiring, if you were on it, as the current proposal stands, if you had a site that was surrounded by other mixed use and had a street front, there would be no step.
I think that's something we might want to look at, because there's,
There was considerable debate about it, and numbers brought in about how it works or doesn't work from an economics point of view. Some were swayed, some were not. Some said it's important, and then many people felt you get to this height, and people don't look up that high. People, like, if it's more important, actually, I'm not saying I agree one way or another, but many people were saying it's more important at the third story level than it is when you get up to fifth or seventh floor, because people don't walk around like that.
well, yes, I think if they're going to make the argument that you need to not do it at the front because of the step down at the back, if there is no step down at the back, we should perhaps be able to
Something.
say that
Yeah.
there's a step down at the front, depending on what the
Yeah.
surrounding zoning is. Because I'm thinking, a lot of the corridors, Belmont, Hawthorne, Multnomah, they would look better if there was a setback on the, rather
Yeah,
than
they're-
having the tunnel of relatively tall buildings.
The other trade-off was about articulation, so having things come in and out, and they were all way more interested in making sure that the buildings were interesting and not a flat surface. And so that went into the trade-offs too, and that was seen as a higher priority, so.
And is there any thought about having something different on different size lots? Because if you've got just a very narrow lot, you may not really need any articulation, but you might want to have.
It is
We do
does
that.
effectively, yeah, the trigger for the articulation is in the articulation, by the way, would allow, it's flexible enough to allow that.
Top floor to be set back as one of the methods of articulating the building. So that is an outcome that could be a result of the articulation.
And we'll, actually, I think we'll get to that a little bit in a few minutes.
And does the design commission weigh in at the planning commission?
We did have the design commission look at this a couple of different places. The final zone, the CE zone, is approximately the same scale as the CM2. It's a medium scale mixed-use zone, but it's got more of an emphasis on a variety of commercial and light industrial uses. It also has a wider allowance for auto-accommodating uses, although there's a caveat to that. We'll get into in a minute. Returning to the idea I mentioned before about public benefits, the specific bonuses that allow you to go from that.
Before you say that, quick question on the CE zone. Do we require windows on the facing to the streets?
Yes, that's one of the elements of this proposal is actually ramp that up a little bit more than we have.
Because there's some examples on Weidler, other places in the Northeast where buildings were of similar size, similar purpose, that didn't have windows facing the street, and they became attractive nuisances in that space, as well as kind of a drag.
So we're proposing to increase the percentage of that ground level facade that has the windows, depending on whether it's housing or not housing. It's as low as 25%. We're proposing to 40% of the standard in most locations and up to 60% throughout the windows area in some key locations. So the notion I mentioned earlier about having the base entitlement with a secondary entitlement that you can reach through bonuses, there's basically three ways to do that. The first is the affordable housing bonus, which allows you to get 100% up to that bonusable secondary entitlement. And that would be linked to the emerging inclusionary housing proposal, essentially anyone that can be this bonus. The secondary one, or the second one on the list, which is a new idea, would have an affordable commercial space bonus. This is a program we've been talking to the city about. It would allow up developer to earn up to half the allowable bonus by enrolling the ground floor in a program that would promote it to below market rate commercial rent that is targeted to a specific audience of underrepresented and emerging businesses within communities, colonies, growing from communities. So it's a way of potentially protecting existing small businesses that are in a corridor from getting displaced as newer buildings come in and up the rent. It's not a done deal that this is going to be viable, but it's included in the proposal. Yeah, the only way to get to the full bonus is the residential. The third way is that we are allowing transfer.
We are allowing transfer of development rights for historic resource protection as we currently do. That would continue, but the other bonuses that exist in the code would be eliminated.
And run through those bonuses real quick. Or categories.
Well, in the mixed-use zones, we started off from a place where we didn't have additional bonuses available because the floor area for residential is available up to the height and bulk of the zone.
Right.
So these zones that we're working on here never really had the gamut of bonuses that, say, for instance, the Central City bonus does. So wanted to clarify that. We did explore some other bonuses as part of the initial work on this project, and as Eric said earlier, kind of winnowed the list down to really focus on the affordability components as the main bonusable elements.
And again, because currently under the mixed-use code, you don't have a floor area limit essentially, so you can fill up the height and setbacks. There was no currency in order to have a bonus like that.
I'm sorry, I wasn't tracking whatever answer you gave to Commissioner Fritz earlier. Do we have a list somewhere of what used to be a bonusable issue that now we're going to effectively codify?
Well, as Barry mentioned, there's the mixed-use zone. I was a little bit mixing myself up between projects because we're doing so many of these things. But in the mixed use zones and the commercial zones, there currently aren't bonuses because there aren't limits.
And multifamily.
In multifamily, which does occur in mixed use zones, sometimes there are bonuses for things like solar hot water heaters, extra bike parking, things like that, and extra open space, which we are adding requirements for. The other bonus that I want to mention, which is kind of really just a combined package of the ones I just mentioned, is for large sites where the recommendation is that there be an additional ability to gain some additional height on large sites in exchange for a larger package of public goods. And essentially this allows a path for a large site, like let's say a big Fred Meyer redevelopment or something, to a site over 2 acres essentially to go through a process, show us the public benefits they're providing, and it would be required that they do the affordable housing as part of that, as well as provide a public open space, do an energy performance standard, and then go through design review. Through that, then the trade-off would be to gain additional height within the site. And we found that one reason to have this available for large sites is when you get to a really large site, there's not really a viable way to fully utilize the full floor area ratio allowances without doing something like that because of circulation needs and parking and other things like that. So that would be a new tool.
And that's available.
That'd be available in CM2, the medium-sized zone, CM3, CE to some
Yeah.
extent, and also in CX, which doesn't currently have that in some limited areas where it's still applied outside of the central city.
If someone were to take, someone were to take giant rundown Fred Meyer site at 68th and Gleason, say, shows up on this map as a big red square, they could use this.
Yes. And
This
the-
might, not that Fred Meyer should go away, but I hope they either renovate it or.
The
do this, or
trade-off
better yet,
is-
both.
The trade-off is with large sites, you can do kind of a master plan and put the highest buildings at the center of the site away from, or you can plan what's most acceptable. And that there was neighbors felt that was an acceptable trade-off if there was a planning process.
Particularly if we could buffer around the edges and kind of get that transition correct. And I think this helps get to what Commissioner Fish was talking about, maybe a little bit more variety in the scale and maybe not as large as the ones you were describing in Kings Hill, but a little bit more variety in scale of the architecture.
Right. So the map of how that all plays out on the map is on the next page, on page 19. So I'm going to transition from that map then. I want to talk about the overlay zones that are being changed. One is, we alluded to before, there's a new Center's Main Street overlay, and this is on page 20. It's the blue areas on page 20, and it's being applied essentially to our core neighborhood main streets. So each neighborhood center in the comp plan has kind of a core, and that core is currently a vibrant commercial strip. And in these main street overlays, we would require ground floor commercial and increase the window requirements and tighten up the pedestrian orientation standards a little further. So essentially that helps us maintain the continuity of those commercial cores so that we don't have an apartment building right in the middle with no commercial on it, which has been a concern in some neighborhoods. So the business community in these main streets has been supportive of this idea of making sure that we don't dilute those commercial strips by introducing a 100% residential building in the middle. So these blue areas would have required ground floor commercial.
How did you get to the balance?
We started in the center of each center where there's an existing commercial core and essentially mapped the existing commercial core. For areas that aren't in that center, we used a distance from the center of the center, essentially.
And it wasn't just a mapping exercise, so the district liaisons then went out and worked with the business districts and neighborhoods in each one of those areas and had conversations about how far out it should go. And so there was some that's mapping and some that was sort of local public opinion.
Right, and in some cases, there were existing neighborhood plans that informed that by having existing policies. Across the page, on page 21, is a map of the red areas where we're proposing an expansion of the design overlay. And essentially, we're proposing that the design overlay, as a matter of policy, be applied to all areas with the densest urban center comprehensive plan designation, which is also the, well, it's town centers and it's the inner ring corridors, essentially. And so the additions, West Portland Town Center as a town center doesn't currently have that, would get it added. The new town center that that the comp plan includes at 122nd and Division would also get that. The gray on the map is the existing design overlays. So you can see it's been applied to some other centers like Gateway already, and Hollywood and St. John's and Kenton. But the biggest addition here is the inner southeast corridors never had an area plan in the past, and so they would be getting design overlay with this project. And then, as we mentioned before, the DOZA project to really think through the logistics of how design review works and what those guidelines are is an important component to this that we want to get done before this goes into effect.
Maps for a long time now, and every now and then I'll realize I missed something or see something new. So if you look at this map that you just talked about, you know, there's some areas that are fairly rich in existing design overlay, like Selwood Moreland. Great, that's cool. And then a giant area from basically 82nd to Division to McLaughlin to the city limits without them. And yet we're doing a road diet on Foster Road, not just in the area covered by the design overlay. Are we neglecting opportunities to do better in parts of the city that perhaps this map by omission illustrates?
I think our approach was we wanted to have a fair policy that applied to where we put it. And so we targeted the areas that were in the comp plan scheduled to receive the most growth as the logic for where we proposed expansion.
But there isn't one on the gateway.
There is existing design.
Existing.
So that's existing.
Yeah, we didn't have to add it there, it's already
I
there.
see.
But I'm troubled by this, and there's a fair amount of mixed-use zoning in there. Not that much in the southern area. Well, yeah, quite a bit on Foster, Powell.
So we did both. Where was the zoning and where did we see market demand happening quickest? And so it, with the idea too that we weren't going to do it everywhere because we're already overwhelmed by design review in terms of the timing. So there's this balance of if you put it everywhere, you know, so that's the discussions we can have one-on-one with each of you too to see which areas, if there's an area that you think design review should be added to, or on the flip side, have we gone too far?
I don't
So
think we've gone too far. I guess the other question I would wonder about is, given the duration of this plan, is there a phasing option for areas that you don't believe there's as great a market demand for now that could, without further council action or DLCD review, be built into the plan with an implementation date farther out so that the workload issue of design review would be spread over when you hope and expect the market will move?
Could be a discussion, yeah. We had a project scope that we tried to scope to not create too many custom local discussions because we didn't have the bandwidth, so we tried to create a citywide framework for where it should be expanded. But there certainly could be local discussions going into the future about where it's more appropriate in addition to the places we.
I'd like to flag that for a little more thought. I mean, sort of a shadow of second stage. Because again, look how many years have gone into this plan. Look how long it's going to last. Look at how robust market demand is now. No doubt some market trends will emerge before the next plan is done.
One other thing to add to that discussion. One other thing to add on the discussion of the design overlay, as Deborah alluded to in the conversation on Tuesday, the relationship between the comprehensive plan and the zoning and the mixed use has gone to a one to multiple situation. So there is the opportunity for quasi-judicial zone changes on some of those streets. And if they went to a larger scale zone in a place that was appropriate, say the CM3 zone in place of the CM2 that might be existing, then the design overlay would come along with it because the CM3 will always get that. So there's some opportunities that way as well.
Yeah, get some of
The next page, page 22, is an issue that got quite a bit of discussion at the Planning Commission. There was some testimony, and Commissioner Fritz, this was following up on a policy discussion you had in the comp plan about can we use base zoning to help protect historic character in some areas? Should some areas get a different base zone simply because we want to protect that historic character? And kind of the epicenter of that discussion was Multnomah Village, but the Plan Commission did recommend applying that approach in 2 other areas, in a portion of 13th Avenue in Sellwood and in Belmont in the core historic street there. So all 3 of those places, there was a CM1 zone applied rather than CM2 to, which is a downzoning from today to encourage a lower scale and discourage larger scale infill development in that historic strip.
And Multnomah, I'm sure the Multnomah neighbors have flooded you with compliments and thanks, right?
We're waiting.
Mostly we heard from the Belmont folks.
Phone lines are open.
One thing about this is we didn't start with 3 and ended up with 3. We started with a much larger set, and for different reasons, they started dropping out when we were trying to do it comparable, instead of based on the number of people that showed up just at the hearing. That was how, when I say we, it wasn't we, it was the Planning and Sustainability Commission. They very clearly tried not to just be swayed by the number of people that showed up.
There were some additional areas where we recommended it, but testimony, both from the neighborhood and the property owners, was don't do that. We want to see it too. So some areas the Planning Commission took it off the table because there was not support for it. Page 23 is a little more detail on the development standards we talked about. So this illustrates the range of different standards that we've added to the code that gets us beyond just the mountain box. On the back, you can see the step downs to residential zones. For the first time, we're requiring outdoor space for residential uses in the mixed-use zone, so that's also going to require more balconies or roof decks as part of that, or just ground level exterior open space. We're limiting the length of the building facade to more of a 200-foot scale, so if you have those long blocks, you wouldn't be able to build a 5-story, 600-foot long building. You have to break it up to 200-foot increments, essentially, with a recessed plaza. There's also the facade articulation, which is above a certain facade area. The facade has to be recessed or articulated to break up that facade, and that could be met with a vertical bay or a step back at the top, or it could be a step back on the first floor, but it has to be broken up in a way so that it's not just a huge blank facade. That's it. And the way it was written, it wouldn't really apply to smaller buildings because they would reach the facade size that triggers it. We did change the lot coverage and landscaping options to better tailor them to the different types of Portland. These are what are called pattern areas, so there's now a different standard in some of the different parts of town to better reflect local conditions. And probably very important, we added a menu to the landscaping options, particularly
Page 25.
In the page 25. So there are now some additional options to in-ground landscaping, including meeting it through a Nika roof, meeting it through a large tree court, which means right now it's just a 15% requirement, but it could be a 5-foot strip that meets that 15-foot. But if you do a larger area and plant a large canopy tree, you can get a 10% requirement if that area is at least a certain dimension.
Or preserve one.
Or preserve one is another, and then we're also allowing landscaping in a raised podium to count if it has a certain soil depth.
I'm not sure.
And some percentage of that can be impervious pavement as well. So a greater range of urban solutions to meet the landscaping requirement and integrate the green. And this is loosely based on the Seattle Green Factor approach, but we were starting from a different place, so it's a little simpler.
Where's this cool place?
Well, hold it, don't answer that. Let's go around the horn. I just asked that question. Where do you think, Mayor?
Seattle or Vancouver?
No, Dan? Dinner,
I have no idea.
dinner with Steve Novick or Steve picking up his tab. Down the line. Steve?
Just friends like him.
Toronto. All right, we're, gentlemen, please.
South Waterfront?
South Waterfront, yeah.
Whoa, really?
How come none of us, because I had the same
gotta
reaction.
be up on the roof.
What city did you grab that you borrow this from? So where
Where is that working? You know, Bill, it's right in the core, there's a sort of a shared street of pavers and stormwater facilities, and you can't see it from the ground.
Well, yeah, you
but
can't
the
see it.
fact that you're on
Yeah,
super
reflective,
rough. That's cool.
Before we move off this topic, I do want to be clear that the urban green options were designed for use in the inner neighborhood pattern area, so in areas that are typically or traditionally have been much higher degrees of building coverage and have no landscaping requirements to speak of right now. So this was a way to still allow large amounts of building coverage, so pretty significant buildings, but get some green into those locations as well. So in the other areas, eastern and western areas, we're still looking to require some in-ground landscaping because that's more in keeping with some of the character of those areas.
Susan, when's the next time we're going to have a broader conversation about eco roofs and what will be required going forward in all development?
It's going to be different for mixed use than it is for the central city. So as part of the central city, when we finally get all of that bringing here in the next 6 months or so, we'll have that as, it will be a requirement.
In the central city?
Yeah. So we've
That's
shifted
the
that
next-
away from being a bonus, for example, like you were talking about before. Right.
The next issue I want to highlight is on page 26. There are 4 streets on this map that the recommendation is to add a 10-foot front setback to allow wider pedestrian zone along those large streets, which includes Hinckley Second, Barber, and then Division and Stark. And, you may know that the mixed-use zones don't have a minimum setback facing the street, so normally you can go right up to the sidewalk. This essentially is intended to encourage, the picture on the bottom left is at PCC on 82nd, and they've provided a wider double row of trees, wider sidewalk. The new sidewalk on the left is in the private property, the public right-of-way is on the right. This is the vision for those larger streets and larger pedestrian zones.
These are high-traffic corridors where the impact of that traffic volume can sometimes negatively affect residential uses that are real close to the street. So we felt
Even
that-
our standard 12-foot sidewalk, we feel kind of uncomfortable when we have 50 mile an hour traffic
Yep,
by the
yep.
shoulder.
Good solution.
Eric?
Mine keeps coming off. The last topics here, the last series of topics relate to auto accommodating development. We have
Was this designed to get to generate the ire of the mayor? Did you put this in here?
It's not hard on that subject.
well, there's both. It works both ways on this proposal. One proposal that we did change, and this was in response to the retail task force, was to lower the threshold for using what we call the large site option for rearranging setbacks and doing essentially for large shopping centers. It allows a little more flexibility with street setbacks in exchange for a pedestrian and road network with internal to the shopping center, essentially. And so we changed the threshold for the size of use that could be allowed to do that, made it slightly lower. On the other hand, drive-throughs, there was quite a discussion of drive-throughs at the Planning Commission. The initial recommendation was that drive-throughs would be in many of the commercial zone, the mixed-use zones, drive-throughs would be what's called not an allowed new use, but the existing ones could be rebuilt on sites that already had them. The CE zone was the more auto-accommodating zone, and that's where new drive-throughs could be allowed. The Planning Commission had a twist to that, which they said, well, regardless of that, we would like to prohibit them east of 80th Avenue, and that's what that map is. And the logic of that was East Portland has a lot of lower-income communities, communities of color. There was a concern that we don't want to primarily be serving. If you believe that those neighborhoods aren't quite ready for mixed-use development from an economic point of view, we don't want the auto-oriented fast food chain restaurants to essentially be the only thing serving that population. And so they were coming at it from a community development, local economic, let's leave room for the local economy to develop and not let it be dominated by chains, essentially, or which tend to be the drive-through kind of places.
Did the East Portland Action Plan folks comment on that?
They were in favor of that. And I think you're going to hear quite a bit of testimony on that topic. And needless to say, some of the business community that's involved in that industry is not happy with that. Yeah. Parking requirements and transportation, I want to mention that. A couple changes. We didn't drastically change the parking requirements, but a couple things we did do. We made it easier in the regulations to use shared parking and change some of those details. We also made it easier to do commercial parking in our neighborhood centers if it's in a structured parking or if it's accessory to an existing building but not over the maximum. So that allows there to be a market for parking in a way that maybe allows for more efficient utilization of parking spaces so that you don't have to leave an empty space just because the person who lives there is gone for the day. We also, and this is a significant thing you'll hear about, is the recommendation is to require transportation demand management plans for mixed-use apartment buildings with more than 10 units. And what that means essentially is that for the first 6 months of the operation of a new mixed-use building, when the tenants move in, the new requirement would be that building has to provide transit passes or the equivalent subsidy to the bike share or car share system to those residents. It's a one-time for the first 6 months of the building. And the idea is you're having a whole crowd move into one building at once, and you want to set their habits correctly in terms of using transit and using the alternatives to car. So it's designed to discourage and encourage folks to maybe be a one-car household and have other options. And this is something that Seattle has done as they've talked about their parking requirements. And we believe this is the right move if we want to better manage our transportation system. We need to be talking about behavior and programmatic approaches, not just how we build the built environment. But you will hear a concern about the cost of that and the logistics of that. So possible issues in testimony, and then I want to let Tom have some time. You'll hear about the zoning, the floor area ratios, the scale of buildings and the height and step backs as you discussed. You'll hear about the bonus and how it relates to inclusionary housing, because that's still an active conversation about exactly what that's going to look like. The facade articulation and some of the design issues, there was continued testimony on that. You'll continue to hear about parking, I think. You'll hear about growth capacity and are we allowing enough growth capacity in the mixed-use zones? Because of the way we simultaneously lowered the by right allowance and raised the bonusable amount, there's a concern that by lowering, what if no one uses the bonus? Are we just going to get slightly lower density everywhere, and is that a problem? We think we've calibrated the bonuses to not have that happen, but that's a concern you'll hear from some folks who are more on the pro-smart growth, pro-infill development side of the perspective. Economics, it's going to change the market dynamics of mixed-use development citywide, and people are nervous about that. Some folks are sort of putting projects on hold right now because they're waiting to see what happens to this. And then, of course, the auto-accommodating issue I mentioned is going to be a topic, I think.
Can I clarify just one thing? We talked about the base and the bonus and the change in allowed entitlements. It wasn't a reduction across the board, so it varies amongst the zones. But in a couple of the zones, the base is a little bit lower than would be allowed today, and the bonus is a bit higher.
Okay, that's a good preview, thank you.
So we're going to move on to the employment zone. One thing to stress again is I believe Eric is going to continue to have his every other week, is this right, meetings with your staff, and there's a set time, and they've all become great friends, and they're all working together on all of this. So your staff has been amazing, learning so much about all of this, and hopefully that's being passed on to you. And you're always welcome to crash those meetings so that you can learn some of this directly if you want.
And we also have one-on-ones with some of you scheduled right now. If anyone else needs an additional one-on-one check-in, please contact Susan.
Okay, so a couple other pieces. The first one that we're going to jump into is the employment zoning project. This is an outgrowth of our employment opportunities analysis and our quest to find and protect our industrial land capacity and creating more capacity for new middle wage jobs. We have a couple of different pieces to this. What we're calling a prime industrial overlay zone that implements Metro's regionally significant industrial area regulations. We have some changes to the EG zone to focus it more on employment. We have some new development standards for the private golf courses out by the airport as when they decide to convert to industrial land. We have an expansion of the industrial office allowances in the Central East Side, and then a pretty random assortment of map changes particularly around the EG zone throughout the city. With the prime industrial overlay, that is really focused on our best industrial land in the Portland Harbor and the Columbia Corridor that has the multimodal access to the harbor and the rail lines and the freeways. It is already on Metro's Title IV map, designated as regionally significant in industrial area. And as part of that, some of Metro's requirements actually go farther than what we currently have in our industrial sanctuary regulations. And so we've brought those forward in an overlay zone. Those are limits on new parks and outdoor recreation, limits on major event entertainment like concert halls, and also a prohibition on self-service storage. In addition to that, one of the ideas that we explored through the River Plan North Reach process was limiting quasi-judicial map changes. You know, a property owner come forward, proposes to change something out of industrial to office or commercial, that for this prime industrial area, we would not allow that type of map change. If you wanted a map change, you'd have to come through a legislative process led by the city as part of a larger look of an area, sort of similar to what went on with Cascade Station in terms of a broader public discussion about, is this change in the right place?
So what do you have for, because we did have a policy on allowing parks when needed for adjacent neighborhoods. So
Right.
Is that still
So
allowed?
where the planning commission wound up with respect to parks and where Metro's regulations provide direction is parks are allowed up to 2 acres to serve the local community. Natural areas are not parks because trail and recreation is an accessory use to the primary habitat value. If there's a need or a desire to have a park larger than 2 acres, an active recreation park like a Delta Park, that would have to go through a comprehensive plan amendment process to change it out of the industrial designation and into an open space designation.
But wouldn't that be a quasi-judicial?
No, that would be led by the city, by
Okay.
BPS through a legislative process, not a quasi-judicial process. In the EG zoning, we did a couple of different adjustments, tweaks to encourage more employment uses. We've increased the office allowance from 1-to-1 FAR to 3-to-1 FAR. At the same time, we've decreased the amount of retail that's allowed outright to get away from some of the big box retail that we saw leak into the general employment zone. We've also prohibited new residential uses. Their residential uses are currently allowed as a conditional use. And again, we've seen leakage of some of that into these employment areas. We've also tried to, we have some new standards to reduce outdoor storage and display allowances to get away from sort of the heavier industrial type laydown areas in these EG areas that are often transition zones between the heavier industrial areas and the neighborhood and the commercial districts.
My recollection is there's language like we won't even entertain an applicant bringing a quasi-judicial map amendment if they seek to change a prime industrial to anything other than employment.
Right. In terms of the golf course rezoning, when there's 2 sets here. One is as part of future development, we have some new ecological design standards, some increased landscaping, some requirements for native plants to recognize the ecological values out there along the slough. We are bringing forward, as part of the map changes, IG2 zoning along the frontage that Broadmoor has along Columbia Boulevard. So that goes into place. The designation on Riverside Golf Course, it's still up to them as to when they want to come in and if and when they want to come in and do that zone change. But when these areas develop, we have some increased design standards that have a little bit more landscape and a little bit more focused on native plants. As part of the Central East Side and the Central City planning, there's been a lot of discussion about where to expand the industrial office allocation. Currently, we have it in a pretty narrow area, but we have seen a lot of activity and development. Where the Planning and Sustainability Commission landed is that they wanted to allow that industrial office use in all of the IG1 zones in the Central East Side. Because it was related to the EOA and the need to show additional employment capacity in the Central East Side, we pulled that piece of it forward out of the Central City Plan and into this package here as part of the comp plan. At the same time, we're expanding allowances for industrial office. We're limiting the traditional office categories to 5,000 square feet. And so that's a tighter standard there in the Central East Side. In terms of map changes, we have a lot of different map changes. One of the biggest ones is and these really implement the decisions that you all made as part of the comp plan map. And one of the big ones is out on 82nd Avenue and Gateway, creating some areas of general EG zoning that are sort of in between the centers and between the active retail areas. The one on 82nd is basically between Montavilla and PCC and Division. The Gateway area, actually, it was EG, and 10, 12 years ago, we changed it to EX. We haven't seen a whole lot of development. It still has a lot of that general employment character. And so in order to encourage, I guess, more the employment focus and less of the residential mixed use focus, we're shifting that to a EG zoning. We have a lot of other EG lands out there. Some of them are going, we talked about it at the comp plan level about going from general commercial to general employment, things like the Kmart site on 122nd Avenue. Some of them are former EX zones that we didn't think were appropriate to go to the CM3 mixed use zone. That prime example of that is the Freeway Lands site out near Foster and I-205. We had some others, existing employment uses like the Adidas campus that really was more appropriate for employment zoning rather than mixed use zoning. And so we've tried to clean up the map. I think another area that has garnered a lot of discussion is the transition area between Northwest Portland and the Northwest Industrial District along Vaughan and the ESCO site, and where and when we apply that EG zoning. In terms of code issues and what you're likely to hear in testimony, I think as Commissioner Fritz brought up, the limits on parks and open areas, I think we reached a good spot at that in terms of the PSC recommendations. We will hear concerns about the prohibition on self-service storage. We've actually seen a bump in the number of development permit applications coming in over self-service storage, beating this restriction. And one of the things that we will see we're likely to hear from are, out along the Columbia Slough, there are still pockets of residential, single-family neighborhoods that have residential zoning today, but a comp plan industrial designation given what surrounds them. And we have applied that prime industrial overlay as a protection for if and when it changes, it gets those restrictions. But that has initially triggered a lot of questions about, oh, you're changing me to industrial. Well, no, we're not. You're okay as you are. It could change in the future, but it raised a lot of concerns that we handled through our hotline to try and talk through those issues.
Could you just go back to the Central East Side Sub-District, which I notice is outlined here? What are the regulations proposed for that? Why is the Central East Side Sub-District outlined in red?
Oh, that's for the change to expand the industrial office use allocation in that area.
Okay, no, just in that area.
Yeah. Yes.
What's the objection to our prohibition on self-service storage, since these are facilities that don't generate any jobs, and they're in industrial areas where we're focused on growing middle-income jobs? So what's the objection to our prohibition?
They make a lot of money. You know, they're a lucrative business, and we would be pushing them into the commercial mixed-use zones, in which then they have to pay commercial residential development land prices.
But I mean, the tension here is that these things, I have a little experience with this on an unrelated matter here, I mean, in a city thing, that, I mean, these self-service storage units
Yes.
basically don't create any jobs.
Right. That's why we're saying in our employment areas, we don't want to see those. You're okay in the commercial districts, but you know, you have to compete with those other uses, the retail uses and the residential uses. For that, you have to pay those land prices. I will say what we are starting to see is sort of the 3-story model for the self-storage. So we are seeing increased density there.
I wonder if there's a content-neutral way to tax those things and use the money for economic development. That's your charge for the weekend, Mr. Commissioner.
As long as they're not in industrial sanctuaries.
Yes. Okay, map issues.
Take something out of each self-storage and sell it.
There you go. That's a TV show. Map issues, I think we've had some, we haven't had a lot of testimony on these map changes, but we have had individual property owners come forward. We did have a discussion about where to change the EG zone along Northwest Vaughan and what that meant for the transportation capacity, and there's a change coming up under miscellaneous to address some of that. Again, sort of just people, I guess, wanting to revisit the comprehensive plan map decisions and wanting something more than the EG zone that they're getting. Is there any questions about the employment code changes?
Could you just remind me about the industrial office use? What's the difference? What does that allow?
Yes, Steve?
They're typically what brokers call creative offices. They're primarily software and design-related firms like architecture, engineering, and industrial design firms. And traditional offices are distinguished. That includes medical offices, dental offices, financial banks, government offices. So those are not included.
So how do we know what they're doing inside the building?
It can be a challenge for enforcement over time when tenant improvements aren't being proposed. So it's enforcement is done on a complaint-driven basis, and there are a lot of cases in the Central East Side where we see traditional offices in these areas.
Excuse me.
Okay. Other questions, or we'll move on to the campus institution package?
Okay.
And John Cole will join us, and he has led a 4-year effort in working with the hospitals and colleges and the neighborhoods that surround them to come up with these elements. Again, we're talking about what we have are 16 dispersed colleges and hospitals throughout the city. This does not include PSU. It does not include OHSU, because they either have their own plan district or their own, they're part of the Central City planning. But through the comp plan, we created a new map designation campus institution. And so now we have 2 zones, base zones, to implement that map designation. And the base zones really are sort of based on the character of a more residential campus, like a Reed College or a Lewis and Clark or University of Portland, or an urban campus, which is most of our hospitals, PCC Cascade, PCC Southeast. And so we've come up with a bunch of different, slightly different development standards and allowed uses around retail and service and office and orientation to the street, and development intensity, depending on which type of campus you are. What we've really tried to do is set a sort of overall development envelope, and this was really modeled after the last University of Portland master plan, in which one of the problems that we were trying to solve here is under the current conditional use master plan process, universities, colleges hospitals have to project out 10 years out what they're going to do and where they're going to do it. And if they have to move the building, if they decide they want to be 1 floor bigger, they have to go through a type 3 master plan amendment process. And that was being seen as really burdensome process in what might be a minor change. And University of Portland tried this new model where basically if it's in the interior of campus, they have a lot more freedom to move their buildings around and program around and really focus on the edge of the campus and on the off-site impacts, and which is how we're trying to steer these base zones that would apply to all 16 campuses, which is to give them more freedom in terms of how they use their development space on their campus, but be a little bit more prescriptive on how they interface with the neighborhood, and over time continue to monitor and require the transportation impact reports that they currently have to do as part of the conditional use master plan.
So we currently, I think, we have had discussions with Parks SDCs with campuses, and their claim that because they're providing lots of open space within the campus, they shouldn't be required to contribute as much in system development charges for parks. How would we manage that issue if they're allowed to do a lot, if they're not required to go through a design planning thing for the insides of the campus?
Manage like public access to their facilities, or
making sure that they've got enough open space.
Well, that's where we set these the floor area ratio standards on page 5, in terms of, you know, the especially the residential campus, that 0.5 to 1 is basically where we're at currently in the residential zones in terms of how intensely you could develop a single family lot in the city. And we sort of based it off of that. It gives them a little more breathing room than they currently have, but it is not a, you know, massive development build out like you see at PCC Southeast. The 3 to 1 is similar to what we have in our mixed use zones and what we have in our commercial zones today.
Yeah, okay, that makes sense.
Yeah.
What about not requiring pedestrian standards in residential campuses?
The pedestrian standards refer to the pedestrian orientation for buildings fronting sidewalks. And what we found, you know, like if you think about Reed College or you know, University of Portland, those are set back from the street. They tend to have a nice green buffer around them.
Which is PCC Sylvania?
They are currently a residential campus. We expect a request from them to be a urban campus.
Well, I have a request from me to make them have sidewalks that connect from the sidewalk on the street to the places you want to go.
Right. This pedestrian standards don't refer to sidewalks per se. The sidewalks around the frontage, around the perimeter of the campus and connecting to their buildings, that's all sort of part of the transportation review. We're talking about how their buildings orient to the street.
Well, I'd
We
like
wanna
more
make sure
discussion
that
about that.
We'll make sure that what you were talking about, that we cover that in transportation, and we'll talk to your staff about
Okay,
that.
thank you.
How about Sylvania in particular?
Yes.
I would just add, since you brought that up, that we can't, Eric, we can't hear you. Speak louder.
I just want to mention, since you were talking about Sylvania, that it happens that today and tomorrow they're in a 2-day planning charrette on their campus, which is open to the public about the future of the campus, and that's being done in conjunction with Metro and TriMet because of the Southwest Corridor Transit Project. So that if you have time to stop by and participate in that or send
Only I
staff.
had a waking hour that I was actually spending at home. That would be lovely.
I was there this morning.
Good.
Um,
Talk about that.
As I said, with the new development, one of the things that we really focused on is the transition from the edge of campus and what as buildings get closer to the edge of campus, having them step down in height to match the scale of the zone that may be across the street or adjacent to the campus to provide a more prescriptive, here's how you will step back and allow the taller buildings at the interior of campus, but as you get to that edge, to be more in scale with the adjacent residential uses. As part of this, we are applying these two zones to the 16 campuses. The example on the right is Providence Medical Center right now, and you can see that they have, 5 different zones that they're covered currently under the conditional use master plan. The underlying zones occasionally cause them some difficulty, and so this just sort of provides one rational designation for the entire campus. One of the big issues that we encountered at the PSC and talking about is how do we transition from the current conditional use master plans and the impact mitigation plans to these new base zones. And what we came up with was as these plans expire over the next few years,
Or 20 years ago
or something like that, that basically you have until 2023, the end of 2023, to get on board with the base zones. And so between now and then, you have an option. You could do a 5-year master plan if you wanted to still go through that conditional use master plan. If you have one now, like the University of Portland or Providence, we're going to let you run with that if you want. We think the base zone is a better option, and as we implement this and people learn how to use it, we hope that it will be more attractive. But we went back and forth as, should it be 2020? Should it be 2023? Where should we land? The PSC has recommended 2023. It lets pretty much everybody with a CUMP finish their current development program without having to go through a change. And it gives them plenty of notice to get ready for the new set of regulations.
So what about the 6 that are already expired and we haven't apparently?
So those, they haven't had a lot of development activity, and basically BDS is waiting for them to come in to propose something, and then they'll have to do an update to their master plan, or they can go for conditional uses for individual buildings, on a piecemeal basis, or come 2018 when this is available, the base zones are available, then they can develop under these base zones.
Just a question. It's long been my view that we, as a city, tend to undervalue the presence of all these distinguished colleges, universities that are here, in the sense that, some of them actually used to take pride in being here, but not necessarily of here. Now that's changed. The promotional material really highlights the fact that they're in Portland. University of Portland has done this. They've rebranded themselves as really being part of Portland. But the question I had is, there's a lot of construction going on in these campuses. And, they're raising money from students across the country, building endowments, and then doing a lot of construction. So there ought to be some way to quantify the positive economic impact of all that work? Because it's one of those hidden dividends, it seems to me, of having all these distinguished colleges and universities here, that they're going through big capital spending plan. They're building a lot of stuff. They're putting people to work. We're collecting fees, thankfully. But there's an overall economic impact of what they're doing. Can we quantify that?
We could. We haven't quantified the sort of construction aspect of that. But the reason we've invested so much time as part of the comp plan process in these campus institutions is because over the last 10 years, it's been the fastest growing job sector in the city, and we expect that to continue. And it's a source of good jobs, both sort of high wage jobs and the middle wage sort of administrative jobs as well. And so,
and probably OHSU is a big driver in that. But anyway, without commissioning a study, at some point I'd just be interested in having some back of the envelope way of quantifying economic impact, because the mayor talks about how few cranes there were in the air before he was elected. He came in, now there's a crane on every corner. You can draw your own conclusion from that, but there is so much activity going on in these campuses, and I think it's another way we could celebrate what it means to have all of these institutions in our backyard that are expanding, investing. I'd love to have some way of getting a back of the envelope number.
we'll see what we can come up with. As I said before, we with these zones, we're focusing on the edges of campus and that interaction with the neighborhood. And the other thing that we're sort of keeping as part of the conditional use process is a periodic transportation impact review. Every 3 to 10 years, the campuses have to come in and look at how much growth they expect, what that traffic impact is going to be, and in particular, a more formal requirement for a transportation demand management program to continue to reduce single occupancy vehicle trips to campus. What kind of transit, bike, pedestrian and car sharing incentives, carpooling incentives are they requiring? I would say that this is a program sort of being set up by PBOT on a more formal basis. Right now, you come in as part of a CUMP, you don't know what you're going to get in terms of TDM requirements. And so we're trying to provide a better guidance and more certainty about what you can expect. I think given that change, especially on the part of the institutions, there's a little bit of anxiety about that, and we'll hear some of that anxiety. In terms of what they're going to be required to do in the future, and sort of, I guess they, as we've heard commonly, they want some flexibility, but they want certainty. And so we've been working with PBOT to try and work through that and provide guidance. You will see as part of the TSP package, there's an administrative rule with more rules around this TDM program and what the institutions are going to be required to do. I think the TDM is what we've heard most about from public testimony on part of the institutions. I think we have worked a lot in terms of just the base zone and what they're allowed to do and what they're not allowed to do. We've worked very closely with the institutions to try and both educate them on what the new zones mean, but also try and address their issues. We have a series of maps in the zoning code that sort of capture all of their special approvals, the extra height here or the special setback there. We've tried to capture that and incorporate that into the zoning code to get some of the uniqueness that is in the master plans today. I think some of the neighborhood associations like the conditional use master plan process. They like to really dig into, well, what is that building you're doing and how big is it and where is it going? And they're a little concerned that they're only going to get to really talk about the edges and the transportation impacts. And there's a trade-off there. I think we heard a lot about Emmanuel Hospital and their vacant blocks and what's happening in the future and how can we get more community uses in that. There's nothing in the zoning code that provides that direction. It's a continuing conversation between Legacy and the community about what to do with those blocks. We did hear a lot more of wanting to codify a requirement for good neighbor agreements. It's something that the city attorney really didn't want to get into because the city isn't in a position to enforce those good neighbor agreements. So it is a encouragement. What we do have is we have a requirement for an annual meeting with the neighborhood on part of the institutions, and it's a best practice, and a lot of them do it. But in terms of codifying it as a requirement, it's not something that we're recommending and that the PSC recommended that we do, just because we're not in a good position to enforce the terms of that agreement.
What about the Unity Center over near Providence, near
It's a single building.
well, there's several. It's like Cuyahoga Terrace.
I don't know that one.
It used to be the old state hospital.
Old Holiday Park Hospital now becoming the mental health ER.
So we should. even
So
just
John,
see
our
whether we should-
standard was 10 acres and 100 employees?
We started by focusing on
Hmm,
Campus institutions that met that standard, and then added the National University of Natural Medicine
Even though it's
in
less-
response to testimony in front of this
Yeah.
body.
It's still a campus, it's not a building. It's worth looking at.
So we were looking for larger sites to come under this. So we would have to look at what their base zone is and how they're operating. And I would say, one of the other things like that we looked at, we didn't look at all institutions, just the big ones. And we did, as part of the comp plan, apply this to high schools. But we haven't written a zoning code for high schools yet. That's sort of on the list of things to do as the next steps of implementation. And we haven't looked at other institutions like single medical clinics or churches or that sort of stuff. Okay, moving on. We have one more package. These are all the elements that got left behind. And so we have this miscellaneous zoning code update. There are, I guess, a set of random things. Stuff like, we talked about what would be the appropriate zoning for Portland nurseries. And we said, well, we'll make them a conditional use in the residential zone. And so we have a little section on that. We had some concerns about all of the down zoning on steep slopes and whether we were making unbuildable lots as part of that. And so we have a provision that you can still get at least one house on those lots. These 6 things on the first slide were all part of the package and really didn't garner much in the way of public testimony or discussion. And we notified everybody that was involved, and nobody came to the PSC hearings. On the next page, next slide, the 2 things that did garner quite a bit of testimony were revising the set of maps that are in the RH zone. The RH zone has a base FAR of 2:1. It's a little bit different than the other residential zones. It's not units per acre, but we give a FAR there. And then we have a series of maps where we've allowed up to 4:1 FAR. And so I'll get into this in a moment, but we had quite a bit of testimony about that. We also have on the zoning map future trail alignments, so that when private developers come in, we require that, depending on the type of and intensity of development, we require them to dedicate and build a trail. And we updated the major trail alignment map in the comp plan, and so now this was to change the zoning maps to reflect that. In terms of amending the set of 4:1 FAR maps in the RH zone, where we started was to amend the map by taking away 4 to 1 FAR areas where the RH was changed to some other zone. We had a lot of RH go to CM2 and CM3. We decided that that's a better fit. And so we were pulling these areas off the map to sort of reflect those changes. Well, as part of the testimony, we had a group from Irvington come in and say, you know, and this is on slide 57. There's a strip of land just on the north side of Broadway, north of Schuyler, that really is the transition area between Broadway and the historic district. It's part of the historic district, and it's an area where we think 4 to 1 FAR just is too intense. It doesn't reflect the historic character. And so we considered that, we looked at sort of the scale of development, we looked at the opportunity for future redevelopment, and thought that, yes, in general, this is a pretty good idea for that block north of Schuyler to go to 2 to 1 FAR in that area. And so we brought that map forward to reduce that 4 to 1 FAR area to sort of the area south of Schuyler, between Schuyler and Broadway. Well, when we did that, we had a new request come in from both the Alphabet Historic District and the Kings Hill Historic District to say, us too. We would really like to do that. And so the PSC was compelled by that testimony, and we went back and we looked at where the contributing structures were. We looked at how intensely developed it is, you know, what's at 2 to 1 FAR, what's at 4 to 1 FAR, where's the location. And in the end, the PSC recommended not making a change in Kings Hill because of the tall buildings that are already there, that there was less of a case of a uniform character of significantly less than 4 to 1 FAR. When we looked at the Alphabet Historic District, and these two maps are a little bit hard because the way they fall out in the zoning code, the registration is a little bit different. But the red star in that map is Couch Park and the Metropolitan Learning Center. And where we landed was the area north of there inside the historic district, that would go to 2 to 1 FAR. And the area south of there, it's a little bit more intensively development. There's a few more vacant parking lots, and it's closer to the MAX station at Providence Park. We'll leave that 4 to 1 FAR. So that's their recommendation. I think I'm pretty safe in saying that the Northwest District Association is in agreement with that and likes that recommendation. But that's the change that we made there. On the update to the major public trail alignment, we had a lot of testimony on this. It sort of fell into two camps. We heard a lot from the 40 Mile Loop Land Trust and Southwest Trails. And there was a little bit of philosophical difference about what is a trail master plan map and what is a regulatory alignment that goes on the zoning map. We worked with them. We made a lot of changes to reflect both their concerns and to be a little bit more illustrative about connections and making connections and how it fits the larger picture, but still pretty focused on being that zoning regulatory. If you develop here, we want your trail. We would like to get a trail alignment there. We heard a lot of, or I would say a handful, a dozen property owners saying, hey, I don't want a trail on my property. There were probably a handful of cases that were corrections. Yes, you're right, the line belongs over here. But for the most part, the PSC has not recommended a change because these trail alignments got on a map through other public processes. We just didn't make them up. You know, they've been vetted through parks plans, through metro plans, and oftentimes they're segments of a larger trail. And it makes no sense to just exempt one property owner and cut out 100 feet out of a larger connection. And so for the most part, we have left those on the map. It's still open to negotiation when they come in for a development permit as to whether or not we can get an easement or require construction. It depends on the nature of development, primarily whether or not a land use review is required. There's a nexus there. So it's not a guarantee that we're going to make that connection, but it's certainly an indicator that it's something we're going to ask for. And as being part of the zoning map, it puts developers on notice that this is a big public concern on trying to make that trail connection. And that's what I have.
I want to make just one more note on the trails is one of the reasons we took on the trail question as part of the comp plan to begin with was through our capital planning process with the TSP and the CSP, we realized that Parks and PBOT had different trail plans that were slightly different. And we came to agreement that the city ought to really have one capital trail plan. And that's what really was the impetus to even have this in the comp plan process was bureau alignment in the CSP.
So I have an issue, actually a set of issues I want to raise in terms of these sort of odds and ends. We haven't talked about it before. So one peril we always have when we're doing a big plan like this is that we create either through the plan and the code itself or through how the market works with it a perverse incentive to do the wrong thing. So, for example, it has appeared that until very recently there was a perverse incentive to keep high FAR property in the central city in use as surface parking lots. That appears to be changing. Hallelujah. In part by property owners' decisions, responsible, thoughtful property owners doing the right thing, and in part because the market lets them do more. So there are a couple of issues where I think we may be in that space here, and I'm wondering if we're properly positioned or whether we've addressed it fully. One is the drive-through issue, and I think we're on that one. Maybe what the Planning Commission has come up with is the eureka moment that will create the right incentives to head towards the development pattern that we want, as opposed to something else. The requirement for the encouragement for platting street grids into big commercial sites, a la Hayden Island, good. I think we're sending the right signals there. One that we haven't even talked about that I'm wondering about, and that is billboards. It appears that there's a perverse incentive for some property owners who have rundown commercial or industrial property to leave it in a rundown commercial or industrial condition because of the very lucrative leases that they have with billboard companies for corners of the site. And if they were to build a building there or otherwise remove the billboard, they lose a no-work income stream. Is there anything that we are doing in this plan that will affect that? Is there anything that we should be doing in this plan that will affect that? So that, again, we're building a dense, walkable, urban place with better design. We can't say chainsaw down your billboard tomorrow morning as much as we'd like to, but I just wanted to raise that issue. I think I was on Sandy Boulevard. There's that infamous site over there with a little triangle of land with 3 billboards on it. Development happening all around, but there are those 3 billboards. I just wanted to raise that one. We haven't talked about it. It just occurred to me, but thinking about the weird side effects that we get sometimes from these plans. Again, I think we may be onto something with what we're doing with drive-throughs. It appears that the parking lot incentive is no longer as great as the development incentive, so we maybe without much further work we'll get that one taken care of. But I wanted to at least raise the billboard issue because until now I hadn't thought about it.
The tricky part about that, and we'll have to do a little research, I think, but a number of years ago we removed the billboard and sign code from the zoning code and made it clear that it was no longer land use and that it was a separate question. So it's probably something that we can't do as part of the comp plan package. Or if we do something about it, we need to be very careful in that sense. But we can look at that. I would also add telecom facilities into that category because we're starting to see people. There's literally a building on Williams Avenue where they left the telecom cabinet on the corner and built the new mixed-use building around it. And so, same dynamic.
Yeah, so I think we should look for those and think about, are there things we can tune differently in this that would affect over the long run that property owner's decision to do what Greg Goodman is doing today, saying, okay, I'm going to go ahead and build what the city had in mind.
Not having it part of the land use code actually means we can potentially act on it more
Yeah.
quickly.
Yeah, so at least I wanted to raise it and have us think about it. Other stuff that we ought to kick around even further. This is really, really helpful to get this kind of uploaded before we get back into the gauntlet of the hearings process, so appreciate everybody's
Heads
time.
up as to who will complain about, what people will complain about.
Yes, that's most helpful, to be warned.
Mayor, so that I say one thing while I'm at the table to make it worthwhile having come up here. We do continue to work with institutions to try to get them to a comfort level with the campus institution zones, and they're putting us through our paces
Yeah, good. I bet they
to
are.
do that. And one of the communications that I am struck by that they've made over the past months is we may see them as economic development players in the city, and they are, but they see themselves as something different. Their primary mission is either educating students or improving healthcare outcomes. So as I talk to them about these issues going forward, I acknowledge that that's their frame of reference, and it's improved my communications with them because of that.
Pay no attention to that $5 billion trust fund. Okay, anything else?
This is the benefit of being in this job for a while, and you always say to say what I'm thinking, which is when you were talking about the benefits of the construction jobs, and which are huge, I think, and the huge benefit of the amazing number of jobs in both healthcare and academic institutions, we don't get property taxes from any of them. And some communities around the country do. And they do it in something called a pilot, which is a property tax in lieu of taxes, or, it's a payment in lieu of taxes. We've never had that conversation. Even bringing it up may put a, bullseye on my back or something as I'm sitting here, but I feel like it's a responsibility that we should at least think about it. It's a lot of land, and the good that they're doing for all these other reasons may be why we don't do that, and so that it may be totally why we don't do that, but there are places that do around the country.
Just following up on that with regard to transportation, I know that one of the side effects for actually mapping these facilities or these institutions on our comp plan map is that it makes them more visible to us when we're doing transportation planning. We can see that that institution exists, and we don't forget that that's not just a residential zone over there.
Yeah.
So it puts more burden on us when we're updating the TSP to think about projects that we can build into the TSP that benefit connecting these institutions into the city. And as part of that, it should be two ways where we're talking to them about who's going to pay for that facility. And that the TSP does have a generic line item in the financial strategy for some financial agreements with institutions, all of what was done with the tram or other OHSU facilities. The same approach could be taken with other institutions as they grow in terms of development agreements.
Yeah, good point. They're huge transportation generators. Great work, everybody. Good job. Thank you. Well, there's some of those churches that have